Okay, hey everyone, I'm back with another video. Hopefully the background noise is not too loud. I am working on the next of the work items related issues. So in the last video I did issue number 81, and that was about listing all work items. I'm keeping that open, so I'm not merging that yet, and I'm going to be working on next the create, which is 82. The idea here, I guess I already created one. What? Someone already put some work on it. Let me just see what this work has. We got the console tables. So this was from 2 weeks ago. 7th. Okay, so I think there's some checks that yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, so I do apologize to this person here. I am going to be taking over this branch. Apparently I authored it as well. Does it look familiar to me? I guess, yeah, I don't recall working on this. But it is from 2 weeks ago, and it looks like let's see if it looks like it's finished. Yeah, some things I would change. So I'll go ahead and unlink that branch, or actually I'll just leave that branch in, and then I'll just create a new one. Is okay. So yeah, I'll create a new branch, and can I just create a branch? Yeah. So yeah, I'll create a new branch and I'll work on it. I'm leaving the list work items branch open, or the pull request for that open. This is just to simulate like more than one person working on the project at the same time. Of course, we're going to run into some issues with that, but that's okay. We live with the issues. So if you watched through or reviewed the pull request I made from a while ago, you'll notice we ran into some issues. So I'm not going to copy the code or the commits or anything over, but I am going to peek at it just to remind myself like what I was dealing with last week. I think mostly it was just on the test side. So I'm going to try my best to copy that over. What we'll see is that Git is pretty smart in terms of reconciling a bunch of changes. So if two people come up with the same code change, Git will actually just let that happen. However, it's pretty conservative in doing so. Like it errs on the side of caution. So if there's differences in white spacing, or if there's differences in like line ordering or anything like that, it will throw a merge conflict. But you know, it's better than, because remember that Git doesn't have any concept of like what code you're actually working on. It's just really working on the text of the file. So you don't want to get into a situation where it's like just kind of gibberish, like something that won't compile. So that's why Git is very Git causes a lot of issues, but it's because it doesn't want to take educated guesses when it can. Anyways, let's get started. So first step here should be pretty familiar. We want to create a work item module. We did that with the list work items, but we're not going to be just copying that commit over. But just to remind myself, I see that we have a very similar pattern to the credits. And so I'm just going to be using that pattern. So we have a class, it's going to be a class work items, and it inherits from the I command. And it's going to have a private SDB context, which is you know what, I'm gonna make this non-nullable. So you notice over here, I have put a little question mark so that it can be nullable, meaning that this db variable can be null. But in terms of the work item module, we always need a db, so I'm not gonna let that happen. I did notice on some of the pull requests I reviewed just now that some people were making constructors just like this, where they set the db to null. I'm pushing against that because while it makes sense for the credits to have an nullable DB context, it doesn't make sense for something like the work item, which requires a database to function. But I understand where people are coming from, because they're looking at this and they're like, okay, this has a nullable DB context. Let's do that here. So it makes sense why people are coming up with that. But that's why we have review, right? Sometimes when you're working on a project, you won't have the full context. So it's always good to pass your work around to multiple people. In this project, I'm kind of the only reviewer, and I have like the full context of the project. But in I guess bigger and better projects, you might have more than one person who have different kind of areas of expertise within the project. And so that kind of multi-level review is very helpful, because then it's, people might have an objection from, different points of view. But that's kind of getting into a bit of a hypothetical, which I can't really give a good example for. But in this case, I have a good context because I'm the creator of this project. So we're going to create a work item constructor that receives the LMS DB context DB. And so then we just set this.db equals DB. And you notice once I do so, it makes this guy happy, or this person happy, because we know anytime we construct a work item, we can only use this one constructor, and this one constructor always sets the DB context to something, so we're safe. This is, I don't know how best to describe it, but this is kind of an issue with kind of object-oriented and C# in general, where once we just define this constructor, that automatically makes the default constructor, which is this one, disappear, right? So when we delete this, we get the little yellow squiggly, because implicitly we have a constructor that does this, but as soon as we define a constructor, then this type of constructor that receives no parameters ceases to exist, which to me is an annoying thing, because it's kind of like a rule that if you know, you know. I don't like those rules because they're implicit, right? I prefer a rule that is in your face. I would have preferred a language that if you have to define this constructor, and if you don't, then you can't compile. I don't like it when it's like, oh, if you do this, or if you don't define any constructor, it gives you one for free, and you just have to know that, because I feel like that what becomes unwritten becomes the issue of bugs, and if your bug is because of something that's not written, it's a little harder to debug than something that is, if this constructor had an error, then I know at least it's some code on the page. It's not because of some invisible code that was injected during compilation. But anyways, I shouldn't be rambling as much. Anyways, we need to implement some functions. So this should seem familiar from the last video. But if you didn't watch that, basically because we have this I command interface, it's telling us to define some stuff, some functions, or else we can't compile. So really this interface is a kind of like a guardrail, or like it's a helper for the developer, where if you don't implement something that you need to, then you're in trouble. I'm going to be copying and pasting this because I don't want this to. And this is why the way I split up the work this last few weeks has been terrible, because you can see some duplicate work, right? In terms of project management, we always want to avoid duplicate work. Anyhow, instead of just the verbs being list, we want the verbs to be create, I think that's the pattern we want to use. Don't have the issue open. But yeah, we want to create a work item. So get help verb.create, which I believe this verb.create doesn't exist. So it's going to really get mad at me, but that's fine. Public string get help verb. And then I switch on the verb, and I say if it's case verb.create, which doesn't exist, so this is going to get very mad at me. Then return create a new work item, and if default is to throw an exception. So all of this extra functions for the credits you don't really need to worry about, but we should have a function to create the work item. I'm going to make it a function that returns a work item because, and I know we have some issues because we have a models and a controller basically that has the same name. So some of you I saw actually did a great job at figuring out that we need this specifier, or else we don't know which work item we're returning. But you notice in this case, we're going to return a models work item because we want to return what we create. And you'll notice this is a very common pattern in a lot of applications. You can think of applications as just little things that work on data, and it creates data, deletes data, whatever, reads data, or does the CRUD on data. And so whenever you create something, you just return what you create. And that's that you find that on like every program in existence, basically. So let's look at what we want here. We want to create a work item. So this is the issue we're working on. It should receive some arguments. It has some optional arguments. And I was in discussion with some folks who rightly pointed out that well, what if these arguments don't exist? Like, how do we define that? And I'll show you how in a second. But the order we receive them is the title, when it's due, and then the description. And the due date and the description is optional. So for now, I'm just going to make the arguments just like that. But you'll notice, like, you might think, and rightly so, that this is kind of a flaky way to do it. But that's okay. I think my big issue with programming in general is that I get too worried about like, what's technically correct and, you know, what's the best time to correct. But you can always refactor later. You know, that's a great thing about software. So now that I have my create function, we want to return a new work item. So this is where my DB context comes in handy. We want to say bar. I don't know what the. Do I do like work item? Add entity. Oh, I guess maybe what I need to do is do like a LMS.models work item. I'm going to call this a result. If you went to my lead code session, you might remember that I love boring variable names. I'm going to call this LMS.models.work item. I think it's, do I? Oh, I think I just do the ID. I have to look at the tests. I don't remember how to create a work item. Oh, that's not the tests. And you notice we get a bit of an error right here, but that's fine. we'll fix all the errors later. So in the DB tests, this is one thing nice about writing your tests frequently is that you will be able to figure out how your code should work, especially with the database, which I always find database related code to be messy. So we need a new. I don't think that's actually database related. That's just me being silly. So my laptop is very slow. It's just not like recording, but luckily the audio is at least not terrible. So title equals title. The due at. So I mistyped this, but it doesn't really matter. But I'll just say due at. So for the due date, we need to parse what the user inputs. Because this is a CLI application, whatever the user inputs is going to be a string. That is because we're receiving the input through the command line arguments, and that's always a string. But in general, the user will usually always input a string, and it's your job to figure out what that is, or like how to parse it. Generally, even like, especially with web applications, because like technically on the web application, it's over HTTP, and HTTP by definition is a text-based protocol. But even here, we have to figure it out. So I think if I go to the models and I go to a work item, it's a thing called a date time. We're gonna just say, sure. We're just gonna say that var due date due at parsed equals date time dot. It's usually like a parse. Converts the string in conventions. I want like a format. I don't know if this throws anything. We're gonna just hopefully hope for the best. Due at. Oh, you know what? Remember that the due at parsed is whatever. So do a little question mark. Maybe if you say due at none, null. I don't know how to do this. Yes. I'm sure I might be looking at a fancy. I'm not going to do it fancy. That's another of my problems. I just try to do everything fancy. Okay, so if due, oh my gosh, due at I put a little whatever. Does not equal null. There we go. Does this work item receive? It should just receive a null. Var parse. I'm gonna call it parse due at equals datetime dot parse due at. Else, I didn't. Var parsed due at equals null. Can assign null to it implicitly. Okay, whatever. Date time. Maybe the best way to do this is put that guy up here and then say parsed do at, and then get rid of this. And the reason why I do that is because sometimes in some languages, whatever's in the curly brace is, we call it scoped within this curly brace, which basically means that the variable only exists in that curly brace. So the problem is that if we declare and initialize our variable in the curly brace, it might disappear. Like the rest of the program might not be able to access it. So by defining it up here, it ensures that throughout the whole function that the variable still exists. Now we have to do we have to do the same with description? No, because the description already is a string and we just want it to be a string. We're not going to try to parse it. Oh, now we get the exceptions. So yeah, so this function can throw some exceptions. You might be tempted to put like a try catch around it. So say like maybe if it fails to parse it, maybe then make it null or whatever. But in my case, I'm gonna say that's not necessary. We want that failure to kind of bubble up upstream and for like, the execute function to handle it. We don't want to create a new work item if the do at fails to parse, because this is kind of just like a it comes down to like what you think the user would expect. But for me, I think the user would expect that if they enter something here, that they're trying to like put a valid due at time, and that if it fails, they probably wouldn't want to have it created with a null time. They probably would want to try again. In this case, probably not a huge deal if we went one way or the other. However, imagine this was like, instead of a due time, it was like this was like a hospital app and it was like a patient's ID number, and for some reason the ID number can be null. If it fails to parse for whatever reason, we don't want to just put null there, because that has like, even though the program's still running, like the user would not expect that. I think there's a great example with the Therac 25 that's somewhat kind of similar, where the main part of that is if you have something that fails, like make that failure obvious to the user. Okay, so enough of that, just whatever. I don't know if my work item does not even have a description, so I'm just not going to worry about it. So yeah, so this is a good issue to have. Basically, my spec in terms of my specification in terms of the issue description does not align with the database. So if you were the developer here and you ran into this issue, you would probably reach out to your product lead or some supervisor or something and be like, hey, what do I do? And just checking the time. In my case, I am the product owner, so I know what to do. So we're all good. So here we have the create function. It's so mad at me because there's another issue there. Does not access instance data and okay, that's actually not related. So what we want to do here is add that to the database. So db add results, and what does that? I think that never fails, but you do have to call save changes. You notice that there's some async functions. We're not worried about those in this kind of iteration with a CLI program, because this program is going to be always synchronous. We can't return anything until we create something. But now that we've added it, we can return the result. I think there's going to be, it will throw some exceptions, but we don't need to handle that here. It is probably a really hard thing to test for. But what we can do later is just figure out what exceptions exist and then put a nice catch on these. So we have a thing there. We now need to go to our command line parser and add a new verb. We also have to add a new noun. So for noun, we want to add a work item noun. And then for verb, we want to add blah, 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 blah. We want to add a create. Oops, create. And that should make this fellow happy. Okay. Represents the create verb, creates a new entity of noun, and saves, persists. Okay, whatever. The last thing we want to do is ensure that this create now verb is a valid noun for the whatchamacallit, the command line parser. So I'll add a comment here, and we got a noun that's work item. And in this particular issue, the only valid verb is a verb dot create, and that's because the changes from my last pull request have not been added here. For some reason, this one is still mad. I think maybe I didn't implement execute. Why is this? Throw a new expression requires an argument list. Oh, do I have to say invalid verb? Messages and exceptions have always kind of confused me, because I'm like, what is the point? You know, like I think the stack trace is more of a valid thing, but that's okay. So now we have our public void execute, and it receives a verb. I feel like a lot of programming, especially object oriented, is always like, you have a verb and we call that verb a verb. And actually by this point we're happy because the void doesn't have to do anything. But we'll switch on the verb, and we'll say case verb.create. We want to we need to in this case how to say throw new, like, not implemented exception to do, let's say, and it'll break is default. Or maybe it's just default. What is it? Yeah, it's just default. Okay. New invalid argument. I need a faster laptop, clearly. I never know what. I could look just right above, but my computer is so slow. There we go. Whenever you're copying and pasting it, it is a sign that you might be not doing the right thing, and maybe you have some code duplication, but we'll fix that later. Okay, so the reason why I didn't bother with this is because I just really want to test my application first, or at least test this function to create. So I can do so here. The first thing I want to do is say LMS LMS.models.workItem. Why is this? Oh, you know what? I bet on the DB side it's probably mad as well. I'm just gonna fix this guy. New LMS work item. Oh, you know what? Alright, so over here, we're just like fixing it because there's some namespace collisions. Excellent. And we made a few changes here, so I just want to make sure. .NET test. And as the test is going off, I am going to look at our pull requests because I know that there was a little fix I had to do in terms of the namespacing, which is just going to be a really annoying situation to deal with for all 4 of these issues. But that's okay. So the files changed. And this is why, like, as you're working on this, it's really helpful to collaborate and to point out issues. Yeah, if another person had technically done this other issue, I might be like, hey, like, I'm not able to work on the tests easily because the database is getting persisted between test executions, and I really don't know how to deal with that. There are fixes online, but what you might notice is that I'm just making sure I'm mindful of time. But someone else might have a better solution. In this case, I do have a better solution, and that's just going into the DB tests and not the DB tests, into the DB context and setting the name. So if I go over to the DB context, and instead of this being whatever, I'm gonna just give it a path. Give it the DB path. And I've noticed some inconsistencies with how I have named my variables, and I apologize. So we can fix that later. And I'll just give this a default path. I think this is a little different from how I handled it. Maybe it's a little different, but that's okay. We can always get merge conflicts and just fix them later. So in the DB tests, I'm just going to give it a name, and I'll say DB tests. And credits test we don't really care about, but we do need to have one for the work item. Item tests.cs. We do. Okay, so then we'll make a new class to do our tests. Public class work item test. And I think, even though I am kind of cheating here, I think in the work item tests in this class we had some inheritance as well as some cleanup. Okay, So we got our nice little test stuff that will make sure that our tests are in a different namespace, basically. So there's really not much to test here. The main thing we want to test is that we can create work items. So we'll say create one work item. Oh, I guess it's public. Void create one work item. And what do we want to do? We want to create a work item. So arrange. Remember that our create function doesn't receive the work item itself to create it. It receives the parameters to create it. This is very reminiscent of the controller pattern. So the controller receives the input from the user and then does its business magic and validations and whatever, and then communicates with the database to save it. You can think of, like, in this case, our controller is very simple because you're just creating something. You can think of a more complicated example. You might have a controller that does some checks. So, in this case, maybe we wouldn't want to have items that whose due dates are in the past. Maybe that does make sense. So that would be a check that we put into the controller, and that would be something we test against, right? We might want to say test one invalid work item, for example, and we would expect that to fail. In this case, we kept it nice and simple. So our tests are going to be nice and simple. So string title, we'll say work item 1. And that's all. That's all we need. I'm going to act. We're going to say that our work item that creates. We need to give it the title. We don't need to give it the due date. There's no... Oh. I guess we do need to give it a due date, which we will say is equal to null. Oh, does it not like that? Why is it mad? Oh, you know what? That question mark has to be in there. Okay. There we go. We could just set a default parameter, but I'm not doing that. And then I'm going to say var actual equals this. So, and this is returning our work item. So that's the nice thing about returning, in your create functions, always return what you just created, because then you can test it. And so what do we need to assert? We need to assert that the title is what the actual got set to. So what is this testing? This is testing the work item is getting created in the database, and it's returning what it be passed into it, right? It's not returning something crazy. In a more sophisticated code base, maybe we give it some parameters, and then it needs to do some magic to parse it. Actually, we will see that with the due date. But in this case, it's just very simple. So let's run this test. It's tempting to just write a bunch of tests and then run them all, but even for something as simple as this, like, you need that bit of dopamine fix of a passing test, even though it's super basic. So it is running. I do apologize for how slow .NET is. Maybe it's faster for Windows folks, but for me on Linux, it's insanely slow. But maybe, I don't know if Python's that slow. Certainly once you compile it and you get a release build, then it's fast, but please, Pat. Yay! Okay, we got our fix. So we need to write another test, and this will be create one work item with dates. I'll say with validate. So range string title equals, I'm gonna call this work item 2. Maybe a better approach would be to like give it a bit of a randomized name, but I don't want, because we had this issue of data bleeding through test invocations, I don't want, this fellow to bleed into that test, and then we get a test that passed, even though, yeah. So I'm just going to give it a date. And the way I'm going to test this is I don't really need to test like the parse function itself. I kind of just need to test that the parse function gets invoked. And I know that because what we want is to get a datetime dot, we call that like a expected parsed due at equals datetime parse due at. And so basically when we create this work item, I'm going to assert that the title is the same, but also that the due at is the same as what we put here. So basically you can kind of think of it as like forking our data in a bit. So we call datetime parse on our side in the test, and then we run the tested function, and then we get the data back, and we say, hey, would you get the same result this way. There are fancier ways, like you can use mocking, or some test libraries we can like test that a specific function gets called, but those are fancy, and sometimes simpler is best, and this is certainly a simple way to do it. So if our actual equals work item dot create, and we go to the title, and then we give it the due at. We're not giving the expected due at because that's actually in our assert. So we're gonna have two asserts. Assert equal, and we're gonna say title, and we're gonna say actual title. Oops, I think it's capitalized title. For some reason, .NET or EF Core has this standard of making your public variables, like public members, capitalized, and I don't know why. So this one, I'm not entirely sure how it's gonna go down. But hopefully it works. And actual that due at. There we go. So let's see if that works. Yay, it works. Great. The last thing I'm gonna do as a test, just to keep this video short, I could certainly write more tests, and there is something about the created at that we might want to make sure is correct. But I don't necessarily care, because for me, like, this is kind of like an all or nothing type of thing, and it actually isn't part of the code we're writing. It's part of the database code or the model code. But this, from my perspective, this is more of a issue, if there was one, an issue with either our programmers not knowing something, like maybe .NET is doing something that is implicit or unexpected, or it's the actual bug on Microsoft's side. So which is probably less likely than a bug on my side. That's it. There's one last test. As I'm typing it out, maybe you'll be able to figure out or think of what I'm going to do. Oops. Create one work item with invalid date. So the last thing we want to do is make sure that if we give it an invalid date, that it's not doing, it's not actually creating something. or creating something with a crazy result. And this is probably the most important test, because this verifies your understanding of what the client or the customer wants versus what the developer hears, right? So if like in a perfect team, you will have someone like the project manager look over your test and be like, okay, either they see this test and they're like, this is not right. I do want you to create a work item even if the date's invalid. If you didn't have this test, they would be like, hey, this is a super important test, and when we had that test, this is how I want it to or just in this situation, this is how I want it to be. Or in this case, because I am both the developer and the project manager and the client, I guess, I can, it puts my expectations explicitly. So even for everyone else, after this gets merged in, they can look at it and review it and kind of know what our standard is. So our standard is with invalid dates, we throw an exception. So let's see. So the string, the title, I'll just call this work item 3, but we're never actually going to test check against this because we shouldn't be creating a work item. And then string due at equals, and I will say invalidate. And I think, so we can then go to our code, and we want to look at blah, 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 work item. There's a work item module. And we just want to make sure that our work item parse, we just want to see, what does it throw? Well, it can receive a null, and it's formats exception. So this one, we would probably want to test against this, but turns out we already have because of this. And next, format exception. So we're going to expect a format exception. So let's write that in our tests. I don't know how to do that. We don't want to just run the code because it's going to throw the exception before we can really test anything. But I think it's like exerts exception throws. There we go. What does it do? Is that an action? I'm sure it's just like a lambda. Like you give it a lambda and then it does its thing. Let's see if we can just do that. So assert throws exception type. So what is this exception? It will be a format exception. Let's see if, oh, there we go. Nice. You might need a, I don't know how to best fix this. So we're going to wait very slowly for the linter to give its exception. Introduce parameter. Okay, hopefully you can edit that out. Blah, blah, blah. I think it's just a void and then work item that creates title new at, maybe I might not be doing this correctly. Return. Returns void. Have to Google it. So, let's see. Let's see, sharp lambda. Oh, I just I don't want that. I want some lambda. Every language. Okay, so there's a little whatchamacallit. This is what we want. Or maybe we want this. Yay, there we go. Type format exception. How do they? Okay. Let's see. X unit assert throws. There we go. Maybe you know what a better way to do this would be. I think there's like a type of this function where it receives status. So this. Okay. So we can run that. And it should just work, hopefully. And after this test passes, then what I'll work on is just hooking it up to the whatever CLI, and then we're done. Yay, passed, right? So this throws worked. If you don't know what these like alligator clips refer to, it's basically like specifying the type of variable. So a very common example would be like a list or an array. You might say like, oh, I have an array, and then in the alligator clips, it's integer, right? And then it says, okay, this list or this array only contains integers. So that says what that in. If you've done C++, it's called templating. In other languages, I don't know, it's like type hinting or some nonsense like that. I don't know. But it just specifies, it's usually like for a container type or a variable that might apply to different kinds of variables or different types. So in this case, it asserts and it throws. What kind of asserting, throwing business are we doing? Or we're asserting, throwing that we're a format exception. We're expecting that to be the one thrown and not anything else. So it's important to make this very specific because if you just set any exception, that probably will pass, but like maybe there's different kinds of exceptions. And in this case, you're only caring about a format exception. In this case, it's very simple because it's not much. But actually, if you look at the function, you could also throw an argument null exception, and we don't expect that to happen. Okay, so we did all that. Now it's time to actually finish what we're meant to do. We're gonna have to receive some variables. So I believe in my command line parser, I put like some command line args. So if I look at the program, we can see, I don't think, oh, we do get the command line arguments. Okay. So case noun that's work item, work item equals new work item with the DB context, and then work item dot execute. Oops. Doopy doop. Execute, and then we want the verb. But we need to receive more than just the verb, right? We need to receive the arguments. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna add another function here. And what I'm going to do here is just add another parameter. So param name equals command args and arguments for the command. Command, and then I'll say like string command args, and I'll just give it a default parameter. I don't know if this is the best way to do it. As you make changes to like interfaces and stuff, or in other words, code that affects other bits of code. Oh, actually be in the credits. Yeah, I think the credits is gonna get mad because we don't have a. Okay. So how best to do this? Well, I'm just gonna modify credits because I would say that's kind of the simplest choice. What I'm doing here, we would say it's like not best practice. Like we want to avoid, where possible, to modify existing code. In general, we want to add code, we want to delete code, but we never really want to modify in code. Partially because then maybe our tests have to change. But in this case, since we're adding a parameter and that parameter gets a default value, then we don't really care as much, because our code, first of all, it's the credits, and the credits is kind of like the least important part of our program. Let's be it somehow. Oh no, maybe I spoke way too soon. So what we'll do is we'll copy and paste this. We'll add another interface. Okay, so we got two executes now, one with the command line arguments. And so what we have to do here is implement that last member, or last execute. And we'll do something kind of clever but a little hacky, which is command args. Yeah, is that what I call it? Command args, okay. But here, command arguments, I don't know. And instead of like duplicating the code here, I'm just going to call the one above. And I'm actually going to return the execute from above. And this makes life happy. Can we not? Oh. Okay. Well, okay, we'll just call the args. But this should make this happy. This should make this happy. And then we'll give the command args here. Oh, and then if we go to work item, then we have to string command. So here's is where our code's gonna get very messy when we try to merge it, because I'm gonna add another execute. Verb, and then in this invocation, I'm just gonna throw the new argument exception. Execute must be called. With command args or something. Okay, so here we got our command arguments. We're gonna do our create, and then we're gonna have to return the create. So I'll just call this result because I'm lazy. First thing we're going to do is if the command args is less than 1, we'll say, we'll throw new argument exception. Execute create requires at least a title arg. And then otherwise we're gonna do our results. So results. So I'll get our titles. So I'll get our args from there. So we know it's at least 1. Or do at equals command arg. I'm gonna hope this is like a get function. Get. Get hash code. Is there like a try? First default element at or default. There we go. So elements at 1 and the default. What is the returns default? What is the default? C# element at or default. What is default? What is default? What is the default value? I don't know, but I just want it to be null, maybe. In Python, which is kind of where I was coming from, you can do like a get that's the default value for reference and nullable type is null. Oh, default type for nullable values is null. So, oh, and I put the question mark. So if I say string, it's a nullable string. Excellent. And then var results equals create title do at and then console dot write line. I'm just gonna make this really bad. Console dot write line title equals, and I'll just do that. I'm gonna be careful to give the results. That's title. And because my computer is so slow, I'm just gonna copy and paste a bunch. Oh no, it didn't do what I wanted to do. Okay. Okay, and then so what we want is the ID. We want the title. We want the created at. And then we want the due at. Oops. And it might not look precisely what we want. Oh, count. And then, why is this mattering? Oh, break, I guess. Okay. So now let run. So now I'm just testing my application. So I'll say test. Oops, it should say invalid now actually. If it loads. Yeah. So one thing I want to emphasize here is that we are emphasizing like the work on basically everything besides the front end. Because that's where we notice we get most of the issues. I think there's a tendency, and I speak, and I say this because I know this is myself. I have a tendency of like focusing on like how it looks or how it feels, which are definitely important things, but not as important as getting like their logic down. So let's hopefully see this work, and then we can say goodbye. Nice. And then if I say 24-10-11, which is a bit in the past, but should be fine. And you notice the formatting doesn't really align with what I said in the description. Again, the main bit is that, you know, the ID is incremented to 1. We got the same, a different thing. And if I did something like this, we should be fine. Very, very slow. Excellent. So we got a working implementation. Notice again, we did this. We peeked at the code for the work item list, but we didn't have to copy those changes over. So it's totally valid and totally possible to have work on related items that we then merge in later. I'll make a separate video on the merging process because it is going to be messy. But for you guys, as like you start the programming and start getting used to this, don't worry about the merge conflicts. Like I love working through them actually. And it's great for me because there's only so much I can like practice with Git on my own before it helps seeing real life usage from people that aren't me, because that's how you get better. Excellent. So I can now merge these changes in. Complete A2, and I'll commit, and I sync the changes. And you might notice that all of my pull requests are just one commit. That's totally fine. Some Git strategies, like ways of working, will just have people do one commit at a time, and it'll be like self-contained commits like the way I'm doing. The only reason why I'm having branches and pull requests is, one, that's sometimes how the world works, and two, it gives you a chance to kind of mess up and to have easier review process than to like have to like worry about how your commit is. So in other words, the pull requests are really just to make things easier by giving you kind of a scratch space. But yeah, thank you for watching. I'll edit this down, and yeah, thank you for watching. My next videos will be on edit and delete. Those will be very fast, but thank you very much.